So let us go ahead and get into the Lord's Word. And we're going to go back to Revelation chapter 18 and verse 4. So Revelation chapter 18 and verse 4. Now, when we talk about Revelation and we look at the message that we need to come out of Babylon, for some of us, it's something that is quite a bit distant from us. But we're going to be going through the Old Testament, and we're going to be looking at some of the instances in which God called his people to come out of something. And we're going to see how difficult that was. It wasn't easy all the time. And we're going to go to Exodus chapter 5. And we're going to be looking at the people of Israel when they were in Egypt. And this is one of the times that God calls his people to come out of a place. And we're going to be looking at how difficult that was for them. So going to Exodus chapter 5 and verse 21, Exodus 5 verse 21, it says, "And they said unto them, Let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us." So at this time, Moses has come into the picture. God has told him that he's going to deliver, that he's going to aid in the deliverance of the children of Israel. So Moses comes and he begins to have this dialogue with Pharaoh and tells Pharaoh, you need to let my people go because they need to worship me in the desert. But as Moses is pressing Pharaoh and talking to him and having this dialogue with him to let his people go, Pharaoh begins to put more burdens on the children of Israel. And as a result, as we see here in Exodus 5, the children of Israel begin to hate Moses for it because he's, in their view, he's making their life very miserable. And as they put it, they're pretty much saying, look, you're talking to Pharaoh and you're making us look bad. It says, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. So change was not easy for the children of Israel. And even though God was calling them to freedom, to something that was amazing for them, they still had a hard time. And if we look a few chapters before chapter 5, we see that the Israelites were definitely suffering. And they really wanted liberty, but when it came to making changes and taking a lot of risk, they were not so enthusiastic about it. Now we're going to go a chapter ahead in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 9. And this is what begins to happen with the children of Israel. Moses is still having this dialogue with Pharaoh. And this is what the attitude that they take. In verse 9 it says, Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor. So at this point, the children of Israel are not listening at all. Even though Moses is telling them the Lord is going to deliver us, he's going to find a way, they're not having it anymore. Now, when we go to Exodus chapter 14, and we're going to go from 11 through 12, Exodus 14, 11 through 12, they throw this back at Moses' face once they have left Egypt. And in verse 11 it says, Then they said to Moses, Because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? And in verse 12, Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt, saying, Let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? So now this is just right after they had left Egypt. They are faced with this big trial. They have the sea in front of them, and they also have the Egyptians coming from the back. And all of a sudden, they begin to question Moses as to why he persisted in bringing them out of Egypt. And they throw this back at his face, pretty much saying, look, we told you from the very beginning that we wanted to be left alone. Obviously, the Egyptians were giving them a hard time. And now they're saying, look, didn't we have enough graves in Egypt that we could have died there? We would have been fine. So as we look at the experience from the Israelites, we have to remember that this is going to be the experience of God's people when God is calling us to leave Babylon. It's going to be the very, very same experience. Now let us go to Genesis 19. And as we go through, Let us remember also that God's people in the first place, they really didn't want to leave. They loved the idea of liberty, but they really didn't want to leave. And when we go to Genesis chapter 19 and verse 12, Genesis 19 and verse 12 through 13. Genesis 19, 12 through 13, it says, "The two men said to Lot, 'Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons and daughters of God, sons and daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here.' And in verse 13, because we're going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it." So this is another instance in which God is trying to get his people out of this very bad city. In this case, it was Sodom and Gomorrah. And, the angels come, they're talking to Lot and asking him, "Do you have any other family members that are here in the city that need to come out?" And one of the recurring themes that we're going to see through these stories is that God's people have a very hard time leaving Babylon. They had a very hard time leaving Egypt, and in this case, they have a very hard time leaving Sodom and Gomorrah. And as we continue to read in verse 14 through 15, Genesis 19, 14 through 15, it says, "So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were pledged to marry his daughters. He said, 'Hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city.' But his sons-in-law thought he was joking." And in verse 15, "With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, 'Hurry, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished.'" So Lot's immediate family obeyed, right? They decided that they were going to go with Lot, but his sons-in-law, they thought he was joking. But then something happens. In Genesis 19 and verse 17, God gives them a very specific command. And this is the command that is given to us as well when coming out of Babylon. In verse 17 it says, "As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, 'Flee for your lives.' And this angel gives them 3 commands that they need to follow as they're leaving Sodom and Gomorrah. The first one is to flee for their lives, and the second one that we see there is don't look back. And the third one is don't stop. And when we look at these 3 things that the angel tells Lot and his family, these are the secrets for our success in our Christian experience. The first one is we need to flee from this world and flee for our lives. The second one is we can't be looking back. You can't be looking back and remembering the things that you used to do in the past, or the things that you used to do when you were a slave, a spiritual slave. And the third one is you can't stop. You have to keep going. And then it says, "And don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." But what happens in verse 26? In Genesis 19:26, what happens with Lot's wife? And we all know the story. It says, "But Lot's wife, she looks back and she becomes a pillar of salt." But if you think about it for a second, Lot's wife, she was out of Sodom and Gomorrah. She had obeyed the commandment and she had left Sodom and Gomorrah. But what did the looking back actually tell us? What does this looking back actually tell us? And actually, let's go to Luke 17:32. Luke 17 and verse 32. And even Jesus brings this lesson out. And look what Jesus said. It says, "Remember Lot's wife." And in verse 33, "Whosoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it." So the looking back lets us know a lot about Lot's wife. In the first place is that she still really loved that place. She still loved Sodom and Gomorrah. Her heart was in Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, we're going to go to Exodus 32. Exodus 32, and we're going to go to verse 7 through 8. And we're going to look at an example on how God's people were still very much attached to Egypt, and how many times, again, we can also be attached to Babylon. Even though we might be physically out of Babylon, we can still be attached in our hearts to Babylon. But in Exodus 32, verses 7 through 8, Exodus 32, 7 through 8, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go down, because your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, have become corrupt. And in verse 8, they have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in shape of a calf. They have bowed to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. God's people were still, again, physically out of Egypt, but their heart was still very much in Egypt. And this begins to suggest to us a couple of things. And the first one is that more than coming out of Egypt, God is calling us to make sure that we're not still lusting over Egypt. Now, let us go to our next verse. And we're going to go to Numbers 11, 4 through 6. We're going to look at another example as to how God's people were still very much in love with Egypt. So Numbers 11, 4 through 6. And look at the wording that the Israelites used at this point. It says, Now the mixed multitude who were among them yielded to intense cravings. So the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who will give us meat to eat? And in verse 5, what were they doing in verse 5? It says, We remember the fish which we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. And in verse 6, But now our whole being is dried up. There is nothing at all except this manna before our eyes. Can you imagine? The Israelites had actually left Egypt, but they still had a lot of memories in Egypt. And this is the very same thing with us. Now, there's something that God wants us to do in order to be freed from this attachment that we have with Egypt or with the spiritual Babylon. And going to Numbers 21, verse 9, Numbers 21 and verse 9, it says, So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. And this was God's solution. Right after they were asking God to go ahead and give them the flesh meats and all of these things that they used to have in Egypt, God decides that he's going to give it to them, but then they begin to suffer the consequences for that. And we begin to realize that God's solution for them was that Christ had to come. And this is what the snake on the pole actually meant. Now, we're going to go to Matthew 15:8. Matthew 15:8. And this is how Jesus describes his people's condition. This was their condition. It says, These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And this was definitely the case with God's people. I mean, they had left Egypt, but they still had a lot of these memories that they were attaching themselves to. But then God comes with a solution. In order for them to forget this relationship that they had with their slave masters, God has a plan. And when we go to Exodus 25 and verse 8, we see what was God's solution here. So Exodus 25 and verse 8. This was the solution. It says, And let them make me a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. God's solution simply was, since they had formed this attachment and it was very difficult for them to let themselves free mentally, because, I mean, physically they were already free, right? I mean, they were out of Egypt, but mentally they were still attached to their slave masters. This was God's solution for them. He was going to come and he was going to make life with them. He was going to live in the middle with them. And this reminds me, there was this one study in Portugal that they did specifically with drug addiction. And in Portugal, they were having a very hard time, because whenever the drug addicts would have an issue, the first thing that they would do is they would grab them and they would put them in jail. But after that, I mean, after they finished their sentence and they were out, they still continued to have the same problems. So then the Portuguese government decides that they're going to invest, and they were actually going to invest in research in order to see how can we rehabilitate these individuals. One of the things that they discovered was that in order to rehabilitate them, the solution was quite simple. They simply had to plug them back into society. And this is where the effort came in. Because when you plug somebody in from society into society that has been in prison and has been abusing drugs and all of that, it's very hard to make a connection with them. And how they invested in that, they decided that they were going to go ahead and talk to some of the local businesses and tell them, look, we're going to pay you X amount of money for you to give, this individual a chance to work. And the whole point was that as they worked, they were going to be reintegrated with society and they would make meaningful connections. And as a result, the Portuguese government saw a huge improvement in the lives of these individuals. And the first things that they would tell you whenever they interviewed them and asked them, how did you quit? And the only thing that they could let people know was, they were there for me. They were there by your side. So in the solution for any addiction, the main solution for any addiction, I mean, first of all, you have to be willing to be free from that. But the other one is you need to have connection. And this is what God was establishing with his people. He understood that they had been slaves for a very long time, and he understood that they had a lot of trauma as a result. But in order to cure that, the solution was you need to be connected. And God took the first step. And as we read in Exodus 25, verse 8, he decided that he was going to have them make a sanctuary so he could live in the midst of them. Now, we're now going to go to our next verse. We're going to go to our next verse, and now we're going to the New Testament. And we're going to go to John chapter 15. John chapter 15 and verse 1. John 15 and verse 1. And look what Jesus said was a secret. What was the secret what is the secret to our success? It's in verse 1, it says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. The husbandman. And verse 2, every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, and that it may bring forth more fruit. And then in verse 3, now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. And in verse 4, this is where we have the secret. And in verse 4, it says, abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can you, except ye abide in me. This was the whole point that Jesus was trying to drive home. You can't really experience and bear any fruit and have any results unless you're remaining in Christ, unless Christ is living in you, unless you're allowing Christ to make life with you. And now let us go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 12. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 12, and it says, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of this land of slavery. We see this even in the Ten Commandments. I mean, you go to Exodus 20, and what is the first thing that God tells us right before he gives us the Ten Commandments? Let us go to Exodus chapter 20. What is the first words that God says? Exodus chapter 20 and verse 1. It says, and God spake all these words, saying, and in verse 2, what did God tell them before giving them the Ten Commandments? I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And what is the result? Now thou shalt not have no other gods before me. We need to there's two things that we need to remember. The first one is we can't forget the Lord, and we also cannot forget that he brought us out of the land of Egypt. He brought us out of slavery. Now, let us go to another secret that God gives us in 1 Thessalonians 5:17. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. And it says, pray without ceasing. This was the whole point. You have to stay connected. And inspiration tells us, in like manner, you are a sinner. You cannot atone your past sins. You cannot change your heart. You cannot make yourself holy. But here's the secret. But God promises to do all this for you through Christ. You believe the promise. You confess your sins and give yourself to God. You will serve him. You will to serve him just as surely as you do this, God will fulfill his word for you. So what's the secret here? You will to serve him, and as you serve God, What is he going to do for us? God will fulfill his word to you. If you believe the promise, believe that you are forgiven and cleansed, God supplies the fact that you are made whole, just as Christ gave the paralytic power to walk when the man believed that he was healed. It is so if you believe it. And she continues to say, more than this, Christ changed the heart. He abides in your heart by faith. The very same thing that God wanted to do. And, when he asked the children of Israel to build a sanctuary, is the very same thing that he wants to do with us today. She continues to say, you are to maintain this connection with Christ by faith and the continual surrender of your will to him. And so long as you do this, so long as you surrender, he will work in you to will and to do according to his good pleasure. So you may say, the life which I now live in the flesh, the very same way that Paul said, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And we're going to go back to Genesis 5:24. In Genesis 5:24, and we're going to look at Enoch's secret. Genesis 5:24, it says, Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. And we're going to go now to Revelation 14:4. Revelation 14:4. It says, these are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. So this is the secret. When we look at the coming out of Babylon, we were able to see 3 points. The first one is that God first needs to call us out. As when anything, he's calling us to come out. Once we come out, after he called the children of Israel out of Egypt and he delivered them, what was the very next step? The very next step God wanted to do with them was to abide with them. And finally, he invites them to come into the joy of his salvation. So when we go back to Revelation and we read, as we read in the beginning, Revelation 18:4, God is calling his people to come out of Babylon so we don't share their sins, so that you will not receive also her plagues. The coming out is going to look in different ways for us. And one of the things that we also have to remember is that the very same experience that the Israelites had is the same experience that you will have. It's going to be very difficult in the beginning. And when we look at ourselves and we look at our lives and we realize that perhaps you're looking at your life right now, you're realizing that you really do like those things, back in, the metaphorical Egypt. You still like the things that you used to do before. But remember that the secret for us to disconnect ourselves from these memories, it has to be with the abiding presence of Christ. And when we do this is how we're going to have the victory. We have to make sure that we're always meditating on Christ and that Christ is living in you. And when he does, your life will definitely be transformed.